Melissa, welcome to the Strong Female Athlete podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited about our conversation today.
Me too, because oh my gosh, after so many years of being in the youth female athlete space, I have heard some wild things about underfueling, like forgetting to eat breakfast or just having a banana to sustain the day. And it's really sad because I think sometimes our female athletes just don't know, and their parents also need to be brought into this conversation. And a lot of parents listen to this podcast, and you're the perfect person to discuss the severity of REDS and underfueling in female athletes. And I think parents, ideally, they are in charge of the household. They're the dietitians and the health coaches. So they have to help their daughters along in this journey and making sure that they're setting her up for success. So maybe we can just start off by defining REDS. You're pursuing your PhD in this area. It is so needed for our female athletes. So let's start off with what it is.
Certainly. Yeah, I think this is really important because there's a lot of terms that are thrown around in this space. So, to kind of simplify it for everyone and make sure that we're all on the right page, on the right track here, REDS stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, and it's a syndrome of impaired physiological and or psychological functioning that's experienced by male and female athletes, but we do see that risk is high, specifically in our female athletes. And REDS is caused by an exposure to low energy availability. So, low energy availability, then we have to define as well. And it's any mismatch between dietary energy intake and energy expenditure from exercise. And if those two things aren't aligned, then the body's total energy needs are not being met. And it's going to start pulling away from essential functions like reproduction, energy metabolism, musculoskeletal health, all of these things that we need to be a healthy individual, but also a high performing female athlete are going to be sacrificed if we're not fueling appropriately for the training that we're doing. And so that's kind of like the high level overview and why you can see we get into so many problems with health and performance if REDS is part of the equation for our female athlete.
So, just a follow up question to that. What is the percentage, or what do you know in terms of how many female athletes are suffering from something like this?
Yeah, there's been a lot of great research to try to estimate the prevalence of low energy availability and REDS in female athletes. It can be quite hard to get at, but we do have some data that we can rely on to suggest that the risk is very high, as I mentioned, specifically in females, which is about 23 to 80% of female athletes. And we see that it's particularly high in female athletes who participate in endurance sports. So they have that high energy expenditure from exercise. That's usually why they're at a higher risk. But we also see it quite commonly in athletes who participate in leanness sports, physique sports, weight class sports, where there's a real big emphasis on how a female athlete's body looks, or there's certain targets and metrics for their body being like their body weight, for example, in order to compete. And then any team sport or field sport that also has a high aerobic component can be at risk for REDS. Of course, obviously, like beyond that, it is an individual problem. So it's not to say that if you don't fit into this box that you could not have REDS, but those are the ones to look out for because we see that it's quite high in those populations.
Mhm. Now, it seems like there's two parts to this. There's some female athletes who might be unintentionally underfueling because are they just not knowing how much they're expending and what they need to get back in? Because I've seen some girls be like, wait, what do you mean I need more than 1,200 calories a day? And they just don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So ex just what you said, that we kind of camp those folks into our unintentional underfuelers, and this could be because of a lack of nutrition knowledge, or they don't know how to decipher the messages online about what's meant for a female athlete versus the general population. And they might have changed their training, or they might be transitioning from one sport like during the fall to a winter sport, and just not knowing how to like accommodate their diet for the training that they're doing. But these individuals tend to respond well to education or working with a dietitian, for example, and they just need to be told what to do and they can implement that. Those would be kind of the unintentional underfuelers where we can get on top of it because really it just stemmed from, oh, a lack of understanding and appreciating the needs. Sometimes I think people can hear what they need. You can tell them the numbers, but once they see it in front of them or like across the day, they're like, oh, that's what that looks like. And so that's where you can capture some of those individuals. Um, but as I mentioned, RED is not just a physiological condition. There tends to be a lot of psychological symptoms that are wrapped up in REDS as well. So unfortunately, we do see athletes end up suffering at the same time or as a result of um, other mental health issues like depression, anxiety, body image dissatisfaction. And then, of course, there is overlap here with disordered eating or eating disorders where there's particularly a lot of restriction occurring or compensatory behaviors that stem from like exercise addiction or exercise dependence. And so those are a lot of the trickier cases, right? Is they're potentially knowing that what they're doing isn't great. Um, and so it can be really hard to come out of that. And we need a multidisciplinary team. We need parents on board. We need coaches on board because that athlete really needs a lot of support to come out of that. And sometimes those athletes can end up there because they really care about their performance, right? And so they ended up in this place where they were exercising a lot or training super hard and not taking an off day, or trying to eat like super clean, for example, or really healthy. You hear that a lot where there's just this increased focus on eating. And that takes away from just the common experience of like fueling with what feels good, listening to your hunger cues, and tuning into your body. Um, and so we see it from both lenses, but I would say a lot of the cases that I feel are more prominent, and especially the ones that we tend to discuss more, are the ones that have some psychological overlap because they're also kind of um, harder to solve. So I think we talk about them more because we're like, okay, how do we get through to these athletes and these individuals? How do we help them recover from this? Because it's not as simple for those individuals to just say, oh, you need to eat more, or maybe you need to take an off day or a rest day or back off of training in this way. So they definitely pose a lot more challenges as far as understanding how to prevent and treat if they end up in a state of low energy availability or REDS.
So you mentioned some of the performance and health consequences of REDS. Can you just get into them a little bit deeper, the hormonal ones, and then the injury risk and the musculoskeletal problems?
Of course, yeah. So most commonly we see impaired reproductive function in our female athletes. So this can look like losing a period. We we're particularly concerned with conditions known as amenorrhea, which can be primary or secondary. And I know that we have a lot of younger female athletes or parents of younger female athletes tuning in. And so primary amenorrhea is the failure to reach menarche by age 15. Now, if I'm dealing with a female athlete who's maybe at the collegiate level, this window of opportunity has passed, which is why I want to make sure that we, really focus on it here because this is a window of opportunity for growth and development and bone health that's so essential. And so, if your female athlete has not gotten their period by the age of 15, medical attention and intervention is absolutely needed. We're really concerned about their bone development and their overall growth and trajectory if they're not reaching menarche, which is just the first period by age 15. After that, let's say we have a female athlete who started menarche at age 13 were not concerned with primary amenorrhea. They've established a normal menstrual cycle or a regular menstrual cycle, and now they've lost it for 3 or more months. That would fall into the camp of secondary amenorrhea, which we also are concerned with because bone health is dynamic. Our bone is constantly laying down new bone and taking away new bone or old bone, so it's a dynamic process that we need to keep on top of regardless of our age. But if we're losing our period for 3 or more months, that's again where we really want to make sure that that female athlete is seeking medical attention. And then there's loads of other menstrual cycle irregularities as well. So it's really important to keep track of what your menstrual cycle looks like, when you're getting your period, how long your bleeding days are lasting, how long between periods there are, because if you go, like, let's say you get to a point where you're getting it regularly, but it's over 35 days, so you're creeping up into the territory of getting less than 9 periods per year. That's going to be something that you want to make sure that is checked up on. So there's just a lot of different ways that reproductive function could be impaired, especially with athletes with REDS. And then as a result of that, estrogen is so important for bone. And so we tend to see that there's reduced estrogen due to REDS in female athletes, which can impair their bone health. And this could look like a loss of bone mineral density, a lack of expected bone accrual. So in the adolescent window, our female athletes should be building their bone. Our bone mass tends to peak in the early 20s for female athletes. So if we've got a female athlete that's an adolescent and they're either not building or worse, losing bone, that's going to be really concerning and something that we want to get on top of, because once we've reached our peak, there's not much else we can do. And after our peak, we're all just fending off expected bone loss that's due to aging. So this is why I love talking to athletes and parents and coaches of young athletes, because they're in this opportune window where they can have a lot of impact with the female athlete in making sure that you're getting on top of some of these health concerns. And there's a whole host of them. There's like 14 different health consequences that have been linked to REDS in some way, shape, or form. Some of those look like impaired GI function, impaired hematological health. So there's like blood biomarkers that are out of whack. We think about things like iron or hemoglobin in that case, urinary incontinence, like I said, energy, but glucose and lipid metabolism can be impaired, mental health issues, neurocognitive function, sleep disturbances, cardiovascular function can be impaired, reduced skeletal muscle function. Again, really important for our female athletes would just be overall impaired growth or development. So they're like falling off their growth and trajectory charts, or they're stagnating when they should be growing, things like that. And then reduced immunity, that's quite common, where we start to see a lot more like upper respiratory tract infections in athletes who have REDS. And that, along with their decreased bone mineral density or their impaired bone health, the immunity and the bone health kind of come together for one of our first performance outcomes that we most commonly see, or that we see most regularly in female athletes, which is decreased athlete availability. So this looks like lost days of training due to sickness or injury, missing competitions. And I always tell female athletes, like, it does not matter how much you prepared for the championship at the end of the season. If you get sick or injured before then, like, none of the work matters, but like none of that work is going to show in the championship if you're not available to compete. And so that's one that we're like particularly concerned with. And with all of the performance consequences, can be a carrot for prevention or recovery. Is if an athlete ends up in this place because they're highly motivated, they're high achieving, they want to perform at their best, well, then we need to keep them healthy in order for them to make the gains in training and adapt to the training that they're doing in their sport in order to achieve or perform at their best. We also see like in athletes with red, some other performance outcomes that can be impaired is they're getting a decreased training response. So they're either putting in the same amount of work or they're working harder and not getting that same response. Their recovery is decreased. So this could be like indirectly or directly, where we see certain biomarkers are reduced, and we're actually seeing that they're like not physiologically recovered from session to session. But this could also look like an athlete reporting not feeling ready for the next training session, not feeling replenished after reaching for recovery modalities that they usually would. So they like roll out, they ice, they get treatment, and they don't really feel recovered or ready to go. It could also look like decreased cognitive performance or skill, decreased motivation to train, which I find like really sad because a lot of our athletes that are high performing and might end up in this space are usually in it because they love their sport and they want to do well in their sport. And they might get to a point where their motivation has waned so much that they're just like not interested in getting up for training, or they're not interested in hanging out with their teammates anymore. They just like don't get the same fulfillment out of sport. And then we see more physiologically, like there's, depending on sport type, the priority list here could shift, but we see things like decreased muscle strength, decreased endurance performance, and decreased power performance. So there's some great studies that have looked at some of these outcomes, and I try to pull those up when I'm talking to athletes of like, look, these individuals who weren't fueling properly actually got worse across a number of these metrics, and those who were fueling adequately got better. And so your delta, the difference between those two groups, is getting wider and wider. And we want to make sure that we're creating healthy but also high performing athletes. And so if we're not doing those things, we're losing the fight here as far as performance goes. Like we're definitely not going to beat somebody long term if we're dealing with these issues. But I think that can also be challenging sometimes because performance doesn't always decrease initially. Sometimes athletes will plateau. Sometimes athletes can continue to get better even though their health is suffering, because we don't always see these things from the outside. Sometimes it's what's going on inside of us, right? And not, presenting as like an injury initially. So we don't always see that performance responds in the same timeline or same fashion for every athlete. So I think it's really important for our parents, for our coaches to be really mindful that we should care because an athlete's health can suffer, not just because their performance can suffer, but we certainly want to get to a place where we're helping with their performance as well, but we just don't want it to only hinge on that, if that makes sense.
I want to go deeper into the performance consequences
Yeah.
because when female athletes might be looking slower on the field or not as fit or not as explosive and powerful, oftentimes the first thing the parent will say is, we need to hire a trainer. We need to do more training. She is not fit. And as a performance coach, I'm like, wait a minute. Do you really need me right now? Or could this be a Reds under eating problem? Because if it is, the last thing you want to do is add more training with a trainer and just be breaking down your muscles more and overusing. And that's what I really want to hammer home with parents on this. It is not always a she is slow issue. She needs a speed coach.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's really important to highlight, especially because you're basically adding like gas to the fire when you add things like that in, if this is a problem. And if it's not, I would actually say that that's also an area where we have to be particularly concerned that we are making up for that additional work that's being done with a strength coach, with a performance coach. If you're adding anything in, you're going to increase that exercise energy expenditure. So whether or not that athlete is under fueling, and maybe that's why we see that they're slowing down on the field, if they're adding that piece in, we want to make sure that we're making up for it nutritionally, because that could also add to a scenario for an athlete who might not have actually been in a state of low energy availability. Now they're adding an extra training session in, they don't know how to account for it. So I think as a performance coach, as a parent, those are some important things to point to of like, let's make sure we're fueling before this session. Let's make sure we're fueling after the session, making sure that especially with our younger athletes who are like they're so busy, they're bouncing from school to practice to maybe another practice or hanging out with friends or doing club activities or what have you is making sure that they have like high energy dense foods and ones that have like are packed nutritionally packed so that they're ready to go and they can bring them with them. Convenience foods, we shouldn't be so scared of convenience foods, especially for some of our young athletes who are so active that sometimes that's the only option. We need to make sure that they're replenishing those calories in some way, shape, or form. And so some of those convenience foods that you can always have in your bag, that you can have on hand if you need them in case of emergency. Um, I'm always a big fan of like pack extra snacks, have snacks in the car when you're driving to and from things, or just making it fun for them too. I think as a parent, like part of your like responsibility around food in your home is actually creating a positive food culture where you're not talking about like demonizing food or talking about food as good and bad. And I try to even steer clear of like healthy and unhealthy because it has a similar tone where you're still kind of assigning morality or superiority amongst food groups or certain foods. And so if you can kind of help drive that in your own home, I think that can go a really long way for your athletes and getting curious about like if your female athlete starts to have a food preference, is that just like normal tastes? Like, oh yeah, sometimes I don't like to have carrots and hummus because it just doesn't sound good. Or is it because they're no longer having that type of food because they're assigning morality to it, or because their friend told them that they shouldn't, or they saw something online that called that food bad. Just being curious about like maybe why preferences around food are changing. Those can be really important things to help guide the female athlete. I think they sound small, but they can go a long way.
How much has influencer social media culture maybe contributed to this? Because there's a lot of young girls on TikTok, and we're actually recording this as TikTok might be banned in a few days, who knows? But you see a lot of what I eat in a day is from certain influencers where they have their little salad with some seeds in it and there's like no substance. And these girls think, oh, well, I should eat that. And it's like, well, she's not a high level athlete. She maybe goes to Pilates class and calls it a day. Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
how much has that been influencing and just sort of like the body image and not feeling enough as a female athlete?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of components to consider here. And while social media does provide probably a greater reach of good information around nutrition, and there's more dietitians online sharing good information that maybe athletes didn't have access to before, it's also just increased the pool of information so much so that honestly, not just our adolescent athletes, our young adult athletes, my college students, like we have assignments that's like find something online and debunk it because there's so much out there that's just inaccurate, it's misinformed, it's misguided, and sometimes it can be appropriate and just not appropriate for you. And I think that that's where some athletes tend to struggle the most with social media is when a message isn't meant for them and it's more of like a general health consideration and it's not a consideration for an athlete who's training at the level that this athlete's training at, for the number of hours that they're training at the intensity that they're training at. Like most Americans don't meet the physical activity guidelines. Our athletes exceed the physical activity guidelines for Americans in like 1 to 2 days. And that's meant for like the week for a regular adult. So I I try to like get that across too of like even if it's accurate doesn't mean that that is something for you. But then beyond that, I think that there is this general sense of body dissatisfaction, comparison, whether it's food or bodies happening online. And we honestly don't know enough, which is pretty scary in like the research side of things about the impact of it, both in the short and long term. But as far as body image dissatisfaction goes, we know that like just general people who spend more time online tend to be more dissatisfied with their bodies. We know that those like what I eat in a day videos, even if they don't come from a place of like harm, can be quite triggering and harmful for athletes and general people as well. Like you look at what somebody else is doing, you're comparing yourself. That's a measuring stick and it can be quite harmful. I also have seen some studies or articles come across my page that I don't know too much about, like the algorithm of things, but TikTok has like come under fire for like pushing eating disorder content to users who like follow or like look at that type of content. And you're just like, well, that's, I feel like the exact opposite thing that we should be doing. Like, if I was in control and I saw that people were like looking at this negative messaging, I'd be like, can we fire off some positive messages their way? Like, so I think that there's like a lot that we don't know that happens like beyond behind the scenes with social media that can be quite scary. I think monitoring that stuff can be really important. And I've started like challenging athletes or parents of athletes and myself and my friends like, can you unfollow somebody today? Like, who makes you feel bad about yourself? Why are you still following them? Can you mute them? Like now, you know, if you are worried about offending somebody, like, well, just mute them so they don't show up on your page. Like, why are we following people and engaging in a platform that makes us feel bad about ourselves? And it's not always making us feel bad about ourselves. So I don't want to, I am young enough to be like, okay, I get it. It's fun and it's like allows you to connect, but how can we put guardrails in place so that we're using it in a safer way, if that's even possible? I think it is. Um, but I think that there needs to be some set of standards. Like I try to limit my screen time on Instagram's like the primary app that I use. I've definitely started like in the past 3 years, like unfollowing people where I'm just like, oh, that doesn't make me feel good about myself. And they're not telling me, like, oh, you look X, Y, or Z way, or you're doing this wrong. And like, it's not people outwardly making you feel bad about yourselves a lot of the times. Sometimes it's just the way that you download that information in your own brain that makes you leave scrolling on your phone feeling worse than when you went to pick up your phone in the first place.
And I think that's something where parents do have to step in a little bit with the screen time and those guardrails
Yeah.
and just really understanding what your daughter's following because I think a lot of parents want to remain ignorant to this because they don't want to know, but there is some wild content out there. I'm not on TikTok, but I've heard crazy stories. I've heard about a lot of this eating disorder and skinny content. It's actually insane. And for an adolescent whose brain isn't fully developed, it's very terrifying, the repercussions of this. So I think parents need to be aware of what their girls are following.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would echo that entirely because their brains aren't fully formed. They're not fully developed. And I think that when I tell an adult athlete, let's say, to unfollow somebody that makes them feel bad about themselves, they have a hard time doing it.
Yeah,
So
we
like,
do. Yeah, we all do.
imagine, yeah, imagine a young girl who's like, who can't quite process that it is actually making her feel bad about herself, or, you know, it's just, it's different. And I think that the onus is on the user, unfortunately, to unfollow those people. And that is really difficult for any social media user. So I think the parent does need to help and facilitate and step in because I would love if we could just get rid of those people that post that triggering content. And I've used the report function on Instagram more times than I can count. It is like an interesting pastime. If anyone wants to join in that fight, you can report content for like I think you can report it now for like eating disorder content, or I think you can now for like body related um, posts on Instagram. At least I'm not on the other platforms, but I think that unfortunately that doesn't always like end up at the end of the person who posted it, but it is important to make sure that we're cleaning our Instagram feeds or our social media feeds, and sometimes people need help doing that. And I think that there's a responsibility for like parents to help their adolescent athlete establish those guardrails and explain why they're there. To be quite honest, like I don't think we need to dumb it down for them. I think we can share that like there's genuine concern here and um, that that those guardrails are there to keep them safe, and they don't want to like you don't want to take it away entirely, so that those guardrails will help protect them while they're still using that platform as best they can.
That's good to know about the report feature. I didn't know that, but that sounds very fun.
Yeah, it like sometimes I just get in the mode where I'm like, ugh, social media, and I'll just, like, go and like, rightfully so, like, some of the stuff that's out there is, like,
It's
not
crazy.
positive at all, and so, yeah, you can you can send a report. Like, I don't know what comes of it, but I do know that some of me and my other peers will will do that from time to time and just be like, "Why is this on here?" Like,
Yeah.
there's way more out there than I can keep up with, but, it's a little bit it can at least make you feel a little bit better that you can share your opinion on,
Yeah.
something that's really outwardly wrong or misguided or triggering. Like, that's what I'm most concerned about. I just, like, don't want our young athletes to feel triggered online.
Now, you mentioned earlier that for an athlete who has REDS, initially they might feel a boost in performance, but I wonder how much of that is them just running on adrenaline. Is that a thing? And it's kind of like a false sense of, oh, I'm feeling great, or like a high sort of?
It's a really interesting question. I've not seen it described that way, but I'm not saying no. I think more often than not, there's this equation that goes into performance and body weight and the initial like shift potentially in body weight, but then the physiological catch up that like we know that there's no one body weight that performs best in sport. And so that athlete could potentially get like a little bit of a benefit if they participate in, let's say, like a leanness based sport, but that catches up with them, and so that's why you might see an initial. There's also plenty of athletes who just stagnate, and so, like, they're not getting better and they, like, are trying harder or, um, working more intensely, and it's not going anywhere, and then there's some people who just have, like, a sudden dip. Like, it's not a one size fits all, and I think we're not entirely sure, like, exactly why that is. There's some implications for, like, body composition changes there, um, but I think that that's what can make it really tricky to catch because a lot of the times parents or coaches are just looking for a change in performance to step in, and that can be really dangerous on one end of the spectrum, and then on the other side, it's just that um, we're not prioritizing their health. Like, that should be the priority, and eventually focusing on that will improve their performance or boost it, if you will. Like, I think that the focus on any one outcome can be a dangerous approach because REDS is so multifactorial that we need to ensure that there's a host of like signs, symptoms, indicators that we're looking out for to ensure that we're not missing something because athletes don't always present with REDS in the exact same way. So, yeah, I would say that that's probably where some of the difference in performance comes from, but to be quite honest, I think we don't fully know why as well.
And it never seems to last because eventually their body just hits a breaking point and it's just not sustainable anymore because their internal health is not okay. And I've seen some professional female athletes, like some former sprinters and cross country runners, come out about how they felt good for maybe like 1 to 2 months and then they just completely declined, and then that's when they had to make a change. But are there any like other initial signs that could be red flags, or maybe some like blood work people can get done just to check on that internal health?
For sure. Yeah, I think first and foremost for our female athletes, we talked about the menstrual cycle irregularities. And so the period is a really great vital sign because we have that visual, well, we should have that visual feedback about every month or so. And so if we don't have that, then, we know that follow up is warranted. But there are other things that you miss with that. So, like, you could have some menstrual cycle abnormalities that you're not picking up on, even if you present with regular bleeding patterns. So, I don't want to rely entirely on that, but it is a really nice red flag. One that you can't rely on if you are on some form of hormonal birth control as well. That's an important caveat. But other things that you could get in like a blood panel would be low T3, which is a thyroid hormone, elevated total or LDL cholesterol. Those are like our primary or in secondary out indicators of low energy availability in reds. And then you could follow up, especially with our adolescent athletes. You might look at something like IGF-1. You might look at something like ferritin or hemoglobin to get a sense of like their hematological status. Those things can be really insightful for what's happening internally. Other things that they might present with that you could pick up on, more externally, if you will, would be something like a bone stress injury. As soon as there's a stress fracture, we need to have our ears perked up and potentially follow up with blood work or a DEXA to get bone mineral density and ensure that our bones are healthy and understands the mechanism for that injury. We're particularly concerned. We have a categorization for bone stress injuries. It's considered low risk versus high risk. Any bone stress injury we want to avoid, but high risk sites include the pelvis, sacrum, and femoral neck. So those three sites in particular are ones that would warrant immediate follow-up for REDS concerns. If you have an athlete who has like a tibial stress fracture, let's say, and they present with other signs like they've lost their period, that would be something where you're like, okay, we have two things here. We should definitely follow up. If they present with a tibial stress fracture and it could have been due to training mechanisms or biomechanics or something, maybe more something to keep an eye on while you figure out like the mechanism of the injury. So it's not to say that a low risk one you wouldn't want to follow up, but you might just have your finger on the pulse, let's say, and tune in for some other signs. I think as far as adolescents go, we mentioned the lack of growth in development trajectory. So those like growth curves that they look at the physician's office if they're getting yearly physicals, which hopefully they are, and you notice that they stagnate or they fall off their growth um, and development trajectory, that's a more obvious sign um, in a way, because then you need to either go to your annual physical or I don't know how regular that is keeping track of my height and weight as a young athlete, but if there's parents out there, like that's something that you could definitely discuss with the physician at an annual physical, like how's their growth? Are they progressing? Have they fallen off their charts? Like these are things that hopefully doctors are looking out for anyways, but we do get a little bit more specialized when we're talking about female athletes and then even further when we're talking about conditions of underfueling. So unfortunately, it might be something that you have to advocate for. You might have to ask your physician for follow-up blood work or if they're concerned and do a little bit more of the legwork, especially as a parent of a young female athlete, there might be some advocacy required in order to get across to the physician that you're concerned, and that like more pointed follow-up is warranted.
Now, one of my last questions is for the female athletes who are intentionally underfueling. You mentioned that it's way more than just working with a registered dietitian because it is a very complex situation. So, what are some other professionals that they should consider working with?
So I think a dietitian is really useful. They can help with an individualized nutrition plan. They can work with an athlete on their evolving needs if they're going through injury or a setback or their training regimen has changed. Like they can be really useful in providing that individualized support. But as I mentioned before, if it were as simple as saying to that athlete, like, oh, you need to add in more carbohydrates, or you're missing a post workout snack, or your energy intake's not matching the intensity that you're doing. So we just need to increase that a little bit. And if every athlete responded, I think we wouldn't have such a big problem on our hands. And so I think another essential member of that multidisciplinary team is often a mental health specialist, whether it's a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a therapist. It doesn't always need to be somebody that specializes in sports, but that can lower the temperature on it for some athletes. So, like, if a sports psychologist can help push the agenda along of like making sure that the athlete's supported. Obviously, it's like a physician, a sports medicine physician, preferably, but as long as there's a medical doctor that's helping organize this team or communicating with this team, because they're the ones that can often order some of these clinical workups. And then I think that the people who we actually forget the most about on the multidisciplinary team is the parents and the coaches. But we have to consider that all of these people play an essential role in supporting the athlete. And so if we leave them out of these conversations, then the athlete is only, like they're teetering, right? Like they don't have a well-rounded circle. They're talking to their physician or their sports dietitian, but maybe their parents saying something different to them at home. Or the medical doctor has, recommended that they adjust their training, and the coach doesn't have an understanding of should that be volume or intensity, or should it be an extra rest day. And I think more often than not we do see that like coaches and parents want to be a part of that conversation so that they can help. But if they're left in the dark about some of these decisions, who are actively in conflict with what the medical team is saying, then the athlete is not going to benefit as much from working with those professionals. And so I think we need to think about not just building our medical team, but making sure that the team that's around the athlete, their coaches, their parents, teammates, all of these people are really there to help facilitate the work that's happening with the medical team or the health professionals.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. And it really is about everyone collaborating to help the girl get out of this because it is very serious. And as we discussed earlier in this episode, there's so many performance and health consequences. And we really need to make sure our girls are being provided with the right team. So, my last question, my very last question is the surprise question. It's a fun one. Since this is called the Strong Female Athlete podcast, how would you define a strong female athlete?
I would say that a strong female athlete is one that's adaptable and able to perform in a variety of tasks and isn't only focused on one aspect of their training. So they're able to perform across a variety of modalities, let's say. Like if I have an endurance athlete, I don't think that she's strong just because she's good at endurance. Like I think she's strong if she's well-rounded, if she's getting in the gym, if she can, adapt to different surfaces or training environments and like isn't thrown off because of those things. I think that looks like a young athlete who's participating in a variety of sports, who hasn't specialized yet and can be just as good on the basketball court as they can on the tennis court. And so I think that they're adaptable, that they try a lot of things, and that they're not afraid of what the environment or the uncontrollables can throw at them.
I love that. That's so brilliant because we talk a lot about sports sampling on this podcast, especially for our young ones. So thank you for reminding everyone how important it is. Now, Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the show. I have all of your resources, website, bio, everything you offer. You also have the Fed Collaborative Instagram page, which is a great resource for everything we just talked about. So be sure to follow that in the caption as well. And yeah, this was super. So thank you for coming on, Melissa, and I will see everyone next time.